One of the things that I always felt about, I mean, I grew up loving horror movies, and it always seemed to me that being interested in horror movies was a great education in films, because horror movies know no cultural boundaries. People didn't care what language a film was in, as long as it was the most complete version. There were very few horror fans who weren't actually fairly well versed in international cinema, and that always seemed to me to be a great thing. Now, when I was a kid, horror movies still had something of a stigma about them, and I think that when you were first writing Nightmare movies, you'd gone through the video nasties, and we'd all been quite aware of that. I wonder whether you still feel that that's the case, whether horror has become much more accepted as something about which one can write a weighty tome, and whether you are still as enthusiastic about those films as you were when you were younger. Because one of the things that you address in the book, and it's talked about quite a lot, is that there is a period in your life when horror is the most important thing in the world.
Yeah. That's not where I am at the moment, but I still feel it's really important. Obviously, you now can write a substantial book about horror films, because here we are, published by Bloomsbury, a very respectable publisher. This isn't, eyeball gouging press.
They turned it down.
Yeah, I know. I wouldn't run as many eyeball gouging pictures as they insisted, although that was a problem with the first edition. I think that we now are able to talk about horror, and I do feel, again, someone I've worked with quite a bit recently, Sir Christopher Frayling, the fact that he's been knighted and yet he's a big expert on horror films and spaghetti westerns, and he's got a coat of arms with, "Make my day punk" in Latin on it. I think that shows that there is a certain respectability now, but the whole thing about horror is it's like rock and roll or whatever it is. You don't want it to be too respectable. I think that we now accept that there is this great Gothic tradition. It's like realism as a genre of storytelling is comparatively recent compared to Beowulf or Hercules or Gilgamesh, all these big fantastical stories. That's the great tradition. That's the storytelling tradition. Whether the wife of a provincial vicar is upset or not, that's a Johnny-come-lately genre. And I think, obviously, I did, my degree was in English, not in film. So again, I'm very well aware that, there's this great wealth of literary material. But I think, all those people loved being disreputable too. I think that we need to embrace that. And I think, the it's like, I don't know, who wants to listen to a punk rock group that your dad likes, And sometimes the job of horror is to piss off the straights, isn't it? Is to be the most annoying in your face. And I have, I suppose, reached the point quite early where I became a, oh, come on now kind of person about a certain type of horror.
One of the themes, it seems to me, of what you're writing about is that when you look back, some people believe that there is a great horror period between 1968 and 1978, in which to some extent starts with Night of the Living Dead, ends with Halloween, in which you have movies was considered controversial until very recently, Last House on the Left, Texas Chainsaw, movies which seem to be genuinely angry about something.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that and you talk about this in the book, that if you put those movies next to, for example, Hostel, that the difference is that this set of movies were made by people who were angry and punky, and this set of movies were made by people who were more privileged than that.
I think, if you would have a sociological look at the people who made the great horror movies of the 1970s, they were students, academics. A lot of them had made underground films, political films. Even Brian De Palma started out wanting to be Jean-Luc Godard. George Lucas started out wanting to be Jean-Luc Godard. And so they were people who'd gone to college to avoid going to Vietnam. They'd been draft resistors. They'd lived through Vietnam, Watergate, all this kind of stuff. And that really informs their movies. Maybe it's an aspect of their films that we as a generation, you and me, probably slightly overvalue, because it's something that's interesting, but it doesn't necessarily reflect how frightening they are, how effective they are as horror films. And one of the things I find fascinating is so many of these people, David Cronenberg is a great example. They start out making underground student art films, but at some point they decide to make exploitation movies because they realize they've got to eat and they want careers out of it. But they carry on the concerns of their underground movies into their mainstream films, which is why there's that period where I find really fascinating those of politically informed, engaged films. But I'm sure they played in drive-ins to people who said, "I just like chainsaw movies, me."
A couple of other things I want to ask you. One of them is I have found recently, and this may just be that it's happened recently, that I've seen a bunch of horror movies that not only have not scared me, but have failed to engage me. And one of the things you talk about is the book's called Nightmare Movies. It's not called horror movies.
Yeah.
It's nightmare movies. So therefore, it goes out. It does go into other genres, paranoia genres.
Yeah.
Do you still? Well, two things. Firstly, do you think that a horror movie has to scare you? And secondly, are you actually still scared by horror films?
Answer the first question is no. I don't think, for instance, certain types of comic horror are fundamentally designed to be scary, but they're still valid as what I would call horror films. And I think sometimes, for instance, I don't think Hammer films are particularly scary because they're done more like swashbucklers. They're more action oriented, they're clash of characters. They have moments of eeriness or moments of shock, but they don't work on that kind of sustained feeling of weirdness and dread that some of the Val Lewton films have, or that Halloween has. And the other thing is, I do still occasionally get... So, I mean, one of the things... I agree with you that Insidious is a terrible film, but I jumped like 5 times during it.
Really?
And... I don't know, maybe I saw it with a larger, more chill-friendly crowd. And yet, it's utterly predictable. Everything in it you've seen in the film before, but there are a couple of good socks. And what I always, the film the films I always cite as counterexamples are that Rodney Dangerfield classic Back to School and Eurotrip, which is a really interesting double bill with Hostel, because they are, by any basis, they're terrible. They're not clever. They're not great acted. They're average filmmaking, but you know what? They're funny. And that means that as comedies, they succeed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And sometimes that's what you get with horror films. They shouldn't. And the whole thing about horror, sometimes it's like a joke. It's like the first time you hear... I don't know, a knock-knock joke, it's funny. The 112th time, you just want to throttle whoever tells you. And if you are a kid and the first horror film you see is like Prom Night 2, that's the one that's imprinted on your brain forever as the thing that first, did all those, mirror in the bathroom shocks,
sure.
or, hand through the window shock, all that kind of stuff that is really old hat. But everybody sees it for the first time in something. And so that's a part of horror too. The other thing is that it's harder, I suspect, for you and me to be scared because we know the tricks by now. You know that when a girl in a horror movie goes into a bathroom and does all that thing, moving the mirror back and forth and checking for zits, you know that when the mirror goes back, there'll be a rotting zombie in the show, because we've just seen that. I mean, actually, there was a film recently which did that thing where you didn't get that, but played a lot with the mirror because we all sat there. And that's the thing. You get that one-up thing where the director realizes you know what's going to happen. I mean, there's a really blunt version of this in Tom Savini's remake of Night of the Living Dead, which opens with exactly the same scene as George Romero's film. And you see the zombie staggering back towards... But actually, no, it's just a drunken guy. And the zombie comes from somewhere else in the frame. And you have the, I know what's going to happen. Oh, no, it's not. Stuff. And maybe it encourages filmmakers to be more and more... Although I have a lot of admiration for people who just say, the hell with it, I can get you with the simplest thing. In Scream 2, there's a sequence where Sarah Michelle Gellar is pursued around a sorority house by the killer. And it's got 5 great jumps in it, and it is the most basic, insulting blonde girl chased by killer. And it's almost like Wes Craven saying, I know this script is full of all this complicated postmodern joke gubbins, but you know what? I can just do it with a guy with a knife. That said, Scream 4 didn't work for me at all on that level. But I can still respond to the shocks and the creeping out. But you're right, it's the films that I think are around the edges of horror that still terrify me. I go back to David Lynch, who I still think is the most frightening filmmaker in the world.
Yeah.
But he will never be able to make an actual horror film because...
Well, except Fire Walk With Me
I know. I
it
think,
was the best horror film of the year.
Yeah, I'd say that.
Okay, exactly. Yeah.
But he will never make a film within horror as a genre because one of the problems that horror films, I think, have today is that they're made by the sort of people who preview them out of town and then pay attention to the cards. Where imagine you preview Mulholland Drive or Fire Walk With Me, and you get all these cards back saying, "What's that blue box? Why is that music so loud? What is it?" And then you go to David and say, "Look, can you just make sure this makes sense?" And everybody comes out and say that. I know from talking to people who've been through development hell with horror that this is a problem, is that executives are used to that Robert McKee thing, or the audience always wants to know what's going on. In horror films, if you know what's going on, you're not frightened. Quite often, the point is not to know where you are. And I think that, again, is what Lynch does brilliantly. The first edition of this book ended with Apocalypse Now, which I thought was like a big post-generic melange of every possible type of movie, including the horror film. I ended this one with There Will Be Blood, partly because I really like the title. It's a great... And Apocalypse Now also had a thing where the very last moments were a great way of signing off a book. This is the end.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember the last line of There Will Be Blood.
I'm done.
I'm done. That's right. And that's where I wanted to be at the end of this book. There's also a kind of personal fillip in that it was produced by Joanne Sellar, who arranged the launch party of the last edition of Nightmare Movies. So it shows that we all come round. But it is a film that synoptically is like, I don't know, and it's a wildcat oil man western, isn't it, with a bit of corrupt businessman story, but it's just directed like a horror film. It's got horror film music, it's got horror film lighting, it's got a horror film vampire type central performance. He sleeps on wood, and he does all this sort of sucking stuff. So it's the fact that you can take material from horror and apply it to almost any genre, and you get something which is scary. And quite often, the job of art is to be terrifying.